My 7-year-old daughter wouldn't have frozen to death on that marble porch if the city's most beloved philanthropist hadn't been sitting in her heated living room, sipping a glass of vintage wine, and manually turning off the outdoor heater just because she couldn't stand the sight of a homeless black family staining her perfect estate. Society constantly conditions people like me to believe that wealthy philanthropists are living saints, untouchable angels who graciously sprinkle their excess wealth upon the less fortunate. But they never tell you the horrifying truth. They never tell you that underneath the luxurious mink coats and the rehearsed, holy tears are cold-blooded monsters with absolutely no heart, capable of watching a child die just to avoid a minor inconvenience. It was the 14th of January. The temperature outside had plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, bringing a historic Category 5 blizzard that paralyzed the entire eastern seaboard. My beat-up sedan died in the middle of a deserted road, just 3 hours after my children and I were violently evicted from our slum apartment by a landlord who didn't care about the weather warnings. The storm hit fast, coming down like a suffocating white death sentence from the sky. I had no choice. I hoisted Zuri, my sweet 7-year-old girl, onto my back and held Trey, my 3-year-old boy, tightly against my chest inside my own thin jacket. I dragged my numb, bleeding feet through knee-deep snow, praying for a miracle. When the dazzling golden lights of Vivian Sinclair's mansion appeared in the distance, a massive fortified estate with proud marble pillars and a sprawling portico, I genuinely thought God had heard my prayers. I thought He had guided us to a sanctuary. I collapsed onto her freezing marble porch, my lungs burning with every breath of sub-zero air. I pounded my bare hands against that colossal, custom-built oak door until my knuckles split open and smeared blood across the polished wood. The sound of my desperate hammering was almost entirely swallowed by the howling wind. I screamed until my vocal cords tore. I begged the people inside to just open the door. I begged them to give my babies a tiny corner in the foyer, or even just let us huddle under the awning where the wind wasn't so lethal. I wasn't asking for their money. I wasn't asking to dirty their imported carpets. I just begged for a fraction of their excess warmth to keep my 2 children alive until morning. But the only answer to the desperate, agonizing screams of a destitute mother was absolute, deafening silence. And then I heard it. A sharp mechanical click echoed through the freezing air. It was a ruthless, calculated sound. The warm, radiant yellow light directly above the porch abruptly shut off. The faint, comforting hum of the underground heating system beneath the marble steps died completely, leaving the stone as cold as a morgue slab. They didn't just ignore us. They didn't just refuse to open the door. Whoever was inside intentionally stripped away our last, microscopic source of warmth to force us out into the deadly cold. They turned off the heat to shoo us away, treating us like stray, diseased animals trespassing on their pristine property. The chill began to freeze the blood in my veins, but Zuri, my beautiful, brave little angel, she didn't cry. She possessed the heartbreaking, quiet calmness of a soul forced to grow up way too fast because of crushing poverty. When she saw her baby brother turning blue, his tiny breaths growing dangerously shallow and rattling in his chest, Zuri used the last ounce of her failing strength to take off her only pink knitted coat. She wrapped it tightly around Trey, pulling his little body into her skinny chest to act as a human shield against the biting wind. "Mommy, God will protect Trey, right, Mommy?" That was the very last thing my sweet Zuri said. She looked up at me with eyes that were already clouding over, before she dropped her head onto my shoulder and took her last, shallow breath, right there on the front steps of the woman hailed as the city's greatest humanitarian. A few days later, the piercing wail of ambulance sirens had faded, only to be replaced by the sickening, hypocritical hum of national news broadcasts. Vivian Sinclair appeared on television, looking devastatingly glamorous yet artificially frail. She wore a pristine white cashmere coat, Her perfectly manicured hands clasped tightly together as crocodile tears streamed down her flawless face in front of dozens of flashing cameras. "My heart is completely shattered," she sobbed to the reporters, her voice trembling with practiced theatricality. "I haven't been able to sleep for a single second thinking about that poor, sweet little girl." The storm that night was catastrophic. The power cables in my neighborhood were completely severed by the wind. Everything was pitch black and the security cameras were dead. I swear before our merciful God, if I had known there were suffering souls knocking at my door, I would have welcomed them with open arms. To honor her memory, my foundation will launch the Zuri Hope Program, ensuring no homeless child ever dies in the cold again. She cried. She spun the most flawless, sickening lie in modern history. And by the very next week, tens of millions of dollars from the corporate elite came flooding into her newly formed foundation to praise her boundless compassion. She weaponized my daughter's frozen corpse, turning my tragedy into a blood-soaked marketing campaign to line her own pockets and elevate her social status. When I dragged myself to the wrought iron gates of her estate a week later to confront her about the disabled porch heater, she wouldn't even look at me. She had 5 armed security guards throw me onto the curb like a bag of garbage. They laughed at my grief. How could a penniless, powerless black cleaning woman ever defeat the holy tears of a wealthy white socialite on the front page of the news? But Vivian Sinclair was sloppy. Her blinding arrogance made her careless. She forgot to silence one crucial witness. She never anticipated that Zuri's pink coat would save Trey's life. And the mind of a 3-year-old child is a recording tape that never, ever lies. During those sleepless, agonizing nights in the pediatric intensive care unit, Trey would frequently jolt awake from his sleep. His entire tiny body would shake uncontrollably as he pointed a trembling finger at the empty, dark corner of the hospital room. He kept repeating a single phrase that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Mommy." The red eye. The Snow Queen's house had a red eye looking at Zuri. Through the blinding snow and the suffocating darkness of that night, right on the metallic rim of Vivian's state-of-the-art smart doorbell, a glowing red LED light had been staring right at them. It blinked steadily, as bright and piercing as the eye of a demon enjoying the spectacle of death. To survive and pay off Trey's medical bills, I worked the graveyard shift as a commercial janitor at Vance Security, the exact multi-billion-dollar tech corporation that manufactured her estate's high-end surveillance system. I spend every night wiping down their servers, and I know exactly what that red eye means. If the power cables were truly severed in the storm like she claimed on national television, the entire camera unit would be pitch black and completely lifeless. But when that LED light turns a glaring solid red, it only signifies one undeniable technical reality. The system is perfectly online, connected to the local network, and the homeowner has manually activated the remote live view mode from inside. Vivian Sinclair wasn't asleep. The power wasn't out. That night she was wide awake. She sat right there, safe and warm, manually shut off the heating grid, and calmly stared through her phone screen to watch my daughter take her last breath. The suffocating weight of that realization threatened to crush me completely. How do you wake up every single morning, look into the traumatized eyes of your 3-year-old son, and carry the agonizing knowledge that your daughter's murderer is currently being celebrated as a national hero? The rage inside me wasn't a fiery, explosive outburst. It was a cold, creeping poison that seeped deeply into my bones. It demanded blood, but it also demanded a terrifying, calculated level of patience. I knew with absolute certainty that I could not just walk into a local police precinct and demand justice. I was a destitute black woman with calloused, bleeding hands, a negative bank balance, and a freshly printed eviction notice to my name. If I marched into a police station screaming about a red LED light on a smart camera, the desk sergeant would have laughed me out of the lobby, or worse, thrown me in a psychiatric ward for being a delusional, grieving mother. Vivian Sinclair practically owned this city. She hosted lavish fundraising dinners for the chief of police. She played golf at exclusive country clubs with federal judges. She had the entire mainstream media wrapped tightly around her diamond ring finger, ready to spin, bury, or fabricate any narrative she dictated. She had built an impenetrable, towering fortress of wealth and privilege, and I was just a microscopic insect trying to crack the concrete walls. But monsters with massive egos always make one fatal miscalculation. They believe the people who clean up their messes are completely invisible. They think the working class are just brainless, breathing pieces of machinery, entirely incapable of understanding the sophisticated world they scrub and polish every night. To keep a roof over Trey's head and pay off the mounting mountain of his hospital bills, I worked the graveyard shift as a commercial janitor. But I didn't clean just any random office building. I pushed my heavy yellow mop bucket through the global headquarters of Vance Security, the most elite, high-tech surveillance and data protection corporation in the country. The irony was almost suffocating. Every night, I wiped down the sterile, aggressively air-conditioned server rooms that housed the digital footprints of the ultra-rich. I would stand there in the dim blue light of the mainframe towers, listening to the relentless synchronized humming of the cloud databases, knowing that the undeniable proof of Vivian Sinclair's crime was floating somewhere in that very room. I knew I needed hard, undeniable digital evidence before I could even dream of exposing her. And for a fleeting, foolish moment, I thought the universe had finally sent me a savior in a young man named David. David was a junior systems analyst who worked the late-night maintenance shifts at the Vance corporate campus. He was a good kid, 24 years old, with a soft smile and dark circles under his eyes that mirrored my own exhaustion. He was drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical debt. His mother was dying of aggressive stage 4 cancer, and the American healthcare system was bleeding him dry. We used to share stale, bitter coffee in the basement break room at 3 in the morning. He was one of the very few people in that towering glass skyscraper who actually looked me in the eye. He treated me like a human being, not just a blue uniform holding a trash bag. One night, the crushing isolation of my secret became too heavy to bear. I took a massive risk. I pulled out Trey's crumpled crayon drawing of the red eye, smoothed it out on the break room table, and told David everything. I told him about the disabled porch heater, the blizzard, and the LiveView protocol. When I finished, David was genuinely horrified. The righteous anger in his tired eyes was real. His hands shook as he looked at the crude drawing of the camera. He promised to help me. He promised that we were going to expose the monster together, and that he would use his employee credentials to find the digital footprint she left behind. For 3 nights, David illegally bypassed the internal corporate firewalls, quietly tapping into the Tier 2 local servers that managed regional residential data. Then, late on a Thursday night, he pulled me into a dark, cramped supply closet on the 4th floor. He was sweating, his eyes wide with a frantic mixture of adrenaline and justice. He handed me a single folded sheet of printed data logs. "We have her, Nia," David whispered, his voice trembling as he pointed to a string of highlighted code. "I found the preliminary ping. It confirms that Vivian Sinclair's personal iPhone was actively establishing a two-way communication handshake with her front porch camera during the exact window of the blizzard. The system wasn't offline. She was actively streaming the feed. For the first time since my daughter's heart stopped beating on that marble porch, I felt a warm, blinding ray of hope pierce through my chest. I thought we had finally cornered the beast. "I just need to compile the final encrypted export tomorrow night," David said, squeezing my shoulder reassuringly. "And then we take this straight to the cybercrimes division of the FBI. She is going to spend the rest of her life in a federal cell for what she did to Zuri." I went home that morning and cried tears of profound relief. But I vastly, tragically underestimated the cancerous, corrupting power of elite money. Vivian Sinclair's private cybersecurity team was paranoid, ruthless, and incredibly well-paid. They detected David's low-level, clumsy ping on her restricted residential files almost immediately. Before David could even log into his terminal the next evening to compile the final report, Vivian's fixers intercepted him. I didn't know it at the time, but while I was scrubbing the lobby floors and dreaming of justice for my little girl, David was sitting in the back of Vivian Sinclair's tinted, bulletproof Maybach in a dark, underground parking garage. She didn't threaten to kill him. Monsters like her know that greed is far more effective and permanent than fear. She looked at his crushing medical debts, his worn-out shoes, and his desperate, miserable life, and she offered him an instant, untraceable offshore wire transfer of $3 million. All he had to do was wipe the local server logs, destroy the printed proof, and convince the crazy, grieving janitor that it was all just a technical glitch. She bought his soul for the price of a luxury penthouse. When David met me in the basement break room that night, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The air was thick and suffocating. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He looked entirely different. The righteous fire in his chest had been completely extinguished, replaced by a cold, nervous, and sickening shame. As he reached into his pocket, the harsh fluorescent lights caught the gleam of a brand new, obscenely expensive Rolex watch on his wrist. "I made a mistake, Nia," he mumbled, staring at the linoleum floor. He frantically snatched the printed data sheet out of my hand, marched over to the heavy-duty paper shredder in the corner, and fed the only physical proof we had directly into the spinning metal blades. "What are you doing?" I gasped, lunging forward, but it was too late. The paper was reduced to confetti. "I misread the code," he stammered, taking a step back from me. "The system was offline. It was just a localized power surge that triggered the red LED. Vivian Sinclair wasn't watching anything. You need to drop this." My heart plummeted straight into my stomach. I looked at the shredder, and then I looked down at the shiny new Rolex on his trembling wrist. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the face, knocking the wind completely out of my lungs. The money had gotten to him. The rotten billionaire run system had swallowed him whole. "She bought you," I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of the ultimate betrayal. "She murdered my 7-year-old daughter, David, and you let her buy you. I have my own mother to save, Nia," he suddenly snapped, his guilt rapidly twisting into defensive, ugly anger. "I'm sorry about Zuri, I really am. But you need to let this go. You are a janitor fighting a billionaire. You are going to get yourself killed, and I am not going down with you." He turned his back on me and walked away quickly, leaving me completely alone in the freezing basement. He thought he had successfully destroyed my case. He thought, just like Vivian Sinclair, that a destitute black woman would simply give up, accept her tragic fate, and crawl back into her miserable hole. But David's betrayal didn't break me. It did the exact opposite. It incinerated the very last ounce of fear in my body. If the middlemen were too weak, too desperate, and too easily bought by the elite, I was entirely done dealing with them. I realized that the Tier 2 local servers David had just wiped were only the surface level of the company's architecture. To trap a monster who could buy anyone in the city, I had to go to the absolute top of the food chain. I had to access the unalterable, heavily guarded cloud network. And to do that, I had to walk straight into the lion's den and confront the god of the company himself, Julian Vance. Julian Vance was a man who worshipped at the altar of raw data. He was the founder and CEO of Vance Security, a ruthless, brilliant billionaire famously dubbed the data god of Silicon Valley. He was a man made entirely of ice and algorithms, a sociopathic genius who valued unalterable numbers far above human emotion. Ironically, He was also the primary corporate benefactor of Vivian Sinclair's newly established foundation. He was scheduled to sign a highly publicized $10 million grant for the Zuri Hope program by the end of that very week. To a man like Julian Vance, human beings were flawed, messy, and prone to lying. Data, however, was pure. Data was absolute. And Vivian Sinclair had just unknowingly challenged the absolute integrity of his life's work. That Friday night, during the dead silence of my graveyard shift, I abandoned my heavy yellow mop bucket in a dim service hallway on the 49th floor. My heart was pounding so violently against my ribs that I could feel the vibrations in my throat. I used the master maintenance overrides I had quietly memorized over the past 6 months to bypass the biometric security scanners. I stepped into the private, glass-walled executive elevator and pressed the button for the 50th floor. The presidential suite. The doors slid open with a soft, expensive hiss. The massive office was an intimidating sanctuary of minimalist power, walled entirely by bulletproof glass that overlooked the glittering, sprawling city skyline. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, but Julian Vance was still there. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the world like a king surveying a chessboard he already owned. He was sipping a glass of aged scotch, dressed in a flawless custom-tailored midnight blue suit. He didn't even bother to turn around when the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me. The cleaning staff is strictly forbidden on this floor after midnight. His voice cut through the silence. It was sharp, frigid, and carried the effortless, crushing authority of a man who could destroy your entire life with a single phone call. I didn't apologize. I didn't bow my head, and I certainly didn't cower. I walked straight across the $50,000 imported Persian rug, the harsh industrial chemicals from my scuffed rubber work boots leaving faint, dirty smudges on the pristine fabric. I approached his massive, custom-built ebony desk. I reached into my faded canvas apron, pulled out my son's crumpled red-stained drawing of the security camera, and placed it right next to his expensive crystal decanter. "I am not here to empty your trash, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice eerily steady, anchored to the earth by the heavy, crushing gravity of my dead daughter. He slowly turned around, his piercing, icy blue eyes narrowing in genuine surprise at my sheer audacity. He looked at my worn-out blue uniform, and then down at the piece of trash I had dared to place on his desk. "I am here to tell you that the $10 million check you are preparing to hand to Vivian Sinclair next week is going to directly fund the woman who murdered my child," I stated, locking my eyes entirely onto his. "And your company's technology is the only witness to the crime." He didn't call his armed security detail right away. His sharp, analytical mind was already calculating the variables. I explained the red eye my son had seen. I explained the technical protocol of his own proprietary hardware. I told him how my daughter froze to death while a glowing red LED light watched her from the porch. I told him about the Tier 2 local servers that a corrupted analyst named David had just wiped for a $3 million bribe. Vivian Sinclair thinks she wiped her digital footprint by bribing a junior analyst to delete the local logs, I said, leaning slightly over his desk. "Your cameras don't lie, Mr. Vance." But she did. If the power cables were truly severed in the storm, the lens is dead, the sensors are dead, the lights are dead. But if the eye is red, someone is watching. Your system requires a manual biometric login to trigger the remote live view protocol. You built an entire global empire on the premise that your security architecture is infallible. I am just a mother with nothing left to lose, asking you to look at your own immutable cloud data. Julian Vance stared at the child's drawing, the jagged red crayon circles staring back at him. He didn't erupt into explosive outrage. He didn't offer me dramatic, useless words of sympathy. He possessed the terrifying, absolute stillness of an apex predator realizing its territory had been breached. The integrity of his system, the very foundation of his billionaire status, was being used as a shield by a sociopathic socialite, and to a man like him that was the ultimate, unforgivable insult. He slowly set his glass of scotch down on the desk. He picked up his secure internal phone and punched in a direct extension. "Wake up the senior cloud engineering team," he commanded into the receiver, his voice dropping an octave, echoing like a distant clap of thunder. "I need a silent, fully encrypted, untraceable metadata extraction for the Vivian Sinclair residential estate. Timestamp, January 14th, 11 p.m. to midnight. Bypass all Tier 2 regional servers and pull directly from the master immutable cloud. And I want it on my desk in 10 minutes." The heavy mahogany doors of the presidential suite remained tightly shut. The silence that followed his command was overwhelmingly suffocating. Those 10 minutes felt like an agonizing eternity. The digital clock on his desk ticked forward, each second dropping like a heavy stone into my stomach. I was terrified that David had somehow managed to corrupt the cloud as well. I was terrified that Vivian Sinclair had truly gotten away with murder. Then a sharp, crisp chime broke the dead silence. A notification flashed across the massive, wall-sized glass monitor behind his desk. Julian turned around and stepped up to the terminal. He didn't use a mouse. His fingers flew across a sleek, illuminated keyboard with blinding speed, punching in complex biometric overrides and heavily encrypted master passwords. The panoramic view of the city skyline on the glass wall instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, terrifying void. And then it began to rain digital code. Cascades of bright, glowing blue text rapidly scrolled down the massive screen. It was an ocean of hexadecimal numbers, server pathways, and timestamp data packets. To me, it looked like a chaotic alien language. But to Julian Vance, this was his native tongue. This was the infallible, unalterable digital DNA of the universe he had built. This was the metadata. He leaned closer to the screen, his sharp jawline bathed in the ghostly blue glow of the monitors. For the first time since I had walked into his office, the absolute rigid stillness of his posture broke. I saw his broad shoulders tense. I saw the muscles in his neck pull tight against his expensive collar. He didn't need to say a word for me to know the truth. The data was there, and it was horrific. Wealthy, arrogant people like Vivian Sinclair always make the exact same mistake, Julian began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous gravel as his eyes scanned the glowing blue lines. They bribe low-level employees to wipe localized hard drives, and they think they have successfully played God. But they are completely ignorant of the overarching cloud architecture. They do not realize that my system automatically shadows every single hardware command, every sensor trigger, and every biometric login, stamping it permanently into a master metadata log on a remote server that even I cannot retroactively alter. He pointed a long, steady finger at the first highlighted timestamp. Look right here. January 14th, 11:42 p.m. The severe weather alert was active, but the local power grid to her estate was completely operational. At exactly 11:42, the infrared perimeter sensors detected two distinct thermal signatures on the front porch. Julian highlighted the next line of code, and my breath violently hitched in my throat. 11:43 p.m. An incoming connection request. The system logs a biometric Face ID unlock from an iPhone registered directly to Vivian Sinclair. Mansion's internal Wi-Fi network. The IP address confirms the device was actively connected. Fully awake. At 11:43 and 15 seconds, she manually activated the Live View protocol. The camera's LED indicator switched to active red. My legs suddenly felt like they were made of lead. I had to grip the edge of the heavy mahogany desk just to keep myself from collapsing onto the floor. How long? I whispered, my voice trembling so violently I barely recognized it. How long did she watch them? Julian's jaw clenched. He highlighted a massive block of data transfer logs. The data packets show a continuous, uninterrupted stream. She sat there, actively holding her phone, watching the feed for exactly 18 minutes. 18 minutes. For 18 agonizing minutes, while my beautiful 7-year-old daughter was crying, shivering, and desperately stripping off her only coat to save her baby brother, that monster was sitting in her climate-controlled living room, watching my children freeze to death like it was some kind of twisted, sickening reality television show. But the sheer cruelty of the elite knows absolutely no bounds. The final blow, the kill shot that completely incinerated my soul, was yet to come. Julian's finger moved to the last glowing line on the screen. His voice was no longer just cold. It was laced with a lethal, barely contained disgust. At 11:45 p.m., he read, his words cutting through the air like a surgical scalpel. While she was still actively watching the live feed, Vivian Sinclair manually executed a remote hardware override. She bypassed the automated thermostat and sent a direct kill command to the auxiliary relay. She turned off the underfloor heating grid on the front porch. A choked, guttural sob ripped its way out of my throat before I could stop it. The metallic taste of fresh blood flooded my mouth as I bit completely through my lower lip. It wasn't just negligence. It was an active, deliberate, cold-blooded murder. She didn't just watch them die. She purposefully extinguished their only remaining source of warmth to expedite the process. She slaughtered my daughter with the casual tap of a manicured finger on a glass screen. I stood up straight, letting go of the desk. The crushing weight of my grief had completely evaporated, violently replaced by a cold, indestructible armor of pure vengeance. I looked at the billionaire standing beside me. He didn't pick up the phone to call the police. He didn't hit print to send these logs to the corrupt local newspapers. He knew, just as well as I did, that a woman with Sinclair's wealth would just hire an army of defense attorneys to claim her phone was hacked, delaying the trial for a decade until the world forgot about Surrey. "We are not going to the press, are we, Mr. Vance?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of tears. Julian Vance turned away from the glowing blue screen. A dark, terrifying, and utterly ruthless shadow crossed his face. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his solid gold customized fountain pen. "No, Nia. We are not going to the press," he replied softly, the sheer danger in his tone making the hairs on my arm stand up. "Tomorrow morning Vivian Sinclair is coming to this exact office to collect her $10 million check. I am going to lock the doors, and we are going to bury her alive." The morning sun rose over the sprawling city, casting a brilliant golden light through the floor-to-ceiling bulletproof windows of the presidential suite. From 50 stories up, the world looked peaceful, orderly, and entirely submissive to the billionaires who ruled it from their glass towers. But inside that massive, meticulously climate-controlled office, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. It felt like the inside of a pressurized cabin seconds before a catastrophic, violent breach. It was the morning of the execution, and the gallows had been perfectly, flawlessly set. Right in the dead center of Julian Vance's massive ebony desk rested a single crisp piece of heavy stock paper. It was a certified cashier's check drawn directly from the Vance corporate treasury, made out to the Zuri Hope Foundation. The amount was written in bold, undeniable black ink: $10 million. It was a sum of money so unimaginably large it could buy a private island, corrupt a federal judge, or, in Vivian Sinclair's case, permanently purchase a saintly, untouchable reputation to mask her rotting, murderous soul. I was already in the room long before she arrived. I was wearing my faded, oversized blue janitorial uniform, a heavy canvas apron tied tightly around my waist, and a pair of scuffed, squeaky rubber work boots. I stood quietly in the deepest, most shadowed corner of the expansive office, a yellow microfiber dusting cloth clutched tightly in my calloused hand. To the ultra-rich, the people who empty their trash cans, scrub their imported marble floors, and clean their toilets are practically invisible. We are nothing more than human wallpaper, functioning pieces of machinery that blend into the background. Julian and I had explicitly agreed on this setup. I wasn't going to hide in a supply closet or watch through a grainy security camera feed. I wanted to be standing in the very same breathing space when the steel trap snapped shut. I wanted to look into her eyes when the illusion shattered. I wanted to smell her fear. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. The sharp, aggressive rhythmic clicking of diamond-encrusted Christian Louboutin stilettos echoed loudly across the polished hardwood floor. Vivian Sinclair walked into the room, radiating an aura of absolute, sickening entitlement. She was dressed impeccably for her moment of ultimate triumph, wearing a tailored pale gray Chanel skirt suit that hugged her frame perfectly. A string of flawless, luminescent South Sea pearls rested gently against her collarbone. Over her shoulders, even though the corporate building was perfectly heated, she had draped a luxurious, obscenely expensive silver fox fur coat. Before I even saw her face, the overpowering, suffocating scent of her custom-made French perfume invaded my lungs, aggressively masking the sterile, metallic smell of the office. She walked with the supreme, untouchable confidence of a woman who had successfully deceived the entire world and was now casually strolling in to collect her ultimate prize. As she glided gracefully across the room toward the ebony desk, her gaze briefly swept over the office. Her eyes washed right over me in the corner without stopping for even a fraction of a second. I was completely, utterly invisible to her. She didn't see a grieving mother standing 10 feet away, holding onto the shattered remnants of a destroyed family. She only saw a blue uniform, a dirty rag, and a piece of corporate furniture that didn't matter to her bottom line. The absolute, breathtaking arrogance of her class blindness was about to become the very weapon that destroyed her. "Julian, darling," Vivian practically purred, her voice dripping with artificial warmth and rehearsed, practiced elegance as she took a seat in one of the plush, high-backed leather guest chairs. She gracefully crossed her legs and smiled a blindingly white, perfectly veneered smile, her manicured hands resting delicately in her lap. "It is an absolute blessing to see you this morning. I simply cannot express the depth of my gratitude. Your generosity is going to change the world. Little Zuri's legacy will shine so incredibly brightly because of this." My fingernails dug so deeply into my own palms that I felt the warm, stinging trickle of fresh blood welling up inside my pockets. Hearing my sweet dead daughter's name slide off the venomous, lying tongue of the exact woman who murdered her required every single ounce of superhuman restraint I possessed. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from lunging across the room, grabbing her by that string of expensive pearls, and strangling the life out of her right then and there. Julian Vance did not stand up to greet her. He didn't offer his hand for her to shake. He sat perfectly still in his executive chair, his icy blue eyes fixed entirely, unblinkingly on her face. He looked at her not as a respected business partner, nor as a revered philanthropist, but the exact way a biologist looks at a highly infectious, disgusting parasite writhing under a microscope lens. "The check is right here, Vivian," Julian said, his voice completely flat, utterly devoid of any conventional social pleasantries or warmth. He slowly tapped his index finger against the $10 million slip of paper. Next to it rested his heavy, solid gold fountain pen. Vivian's eyes immediately locked onto the check like a heat-seeking missile. For a fraction of a second, the carefully constructed mask of the grieving, compassionate philanthropist slipped, revealing the ravenous, bottomless greed of a starving vulture. Her smile widened just a fraction, her eyes gleaming with the intoxicating, euphoric thrill of a flawless victory. She leaned forward slightly, reaching her manicured hand out toward the smooth surface of the desk. "I have the Foundation's legal transfer documents and the tax-exempt forms ready for your signature," she said smoothly, practically salivating at the sight of the zeros on the paper. "Before I sign anything," Julian interrupted, his voice dropping into a low, metallic, commanding register that instantly halted her movement in midair. He smoothly pulled his hand away from the check, resting it on the arm of his chair. "I need you to verify a minor technical discrepancy regarding the grant application." Vivian blinked, a fleeting, ugly shadow of annoyance crossing her perfectly contoured face. "A discrepancy? Julian, please, my corporate lawyers and accountants have vetted the entire portfolio 3 times over. What could possibly be missing?" Julian didn't answer her right away. He reached into his top desk drawer and pulled out a sleek black iPad Pro. He tapped the glass screen once, unlocking it with his biometric ID, and then slowly, deliberately slid the heavy glass tablet across the smooth ebony surface of the desk until it came to a halt right in front of Vivian's fingertips. Standard compliance protocol for a philanthropic donation of this magnitude. Julian lied flawlessly, his face an impenetrable, terrifying mask of stone. "Just review the data on the screen and confirm the security metrics for me." Vivian let out a delicate, patronizing sigh, the kind of sound you make when humoring a paranoid, eccentric old man. She elegantly picked up the iPad, the massive diamond rings on her fingers clinking sharply against the glass casing. "Honestly, Julian, your absolute obsession with digital security and data points is precisely why you're a billionaire. But I assure you my home network is perfectly." The words died in her throat. The sentence was never finished. It didn't happen gradually. It was an instantaneous, violent, and complete systemic collapse of her entire physical being. The patronizing, aristocratic smile plastered on her face didn't just fade away. It shattered like a brittle pane of glass hit by a sniper's bullet. From my corner in the shadows, I watched the exact physiological breakdown of an apex predator, realizing it had just stepped squarely onto a live landmine. All the blood violently and immediately drained from her face, leaving her skin the sickly, terrifyingly pale color of wet ashes. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble so violently that the iPad rattled loudly against the wooden surface of the desk as she dropped it. Her breath hitched, a sharp, ragged intake of air completely paralyzing her lungs. On the brilliant retina display of that tablet, there were no legal contracts. There were no philanthropic tax forms or banking details. There was only a solid black background filled entirely with bright, glowing red text. It was the Vance Cloud Enterprise log audit. It was the absolute, undeniable metadata of her sins. What is this?" Vivian choked out, her voice suddenly sounding incredibly small, frail, and frantic. She desperately tried to push the iPad away from her, sliding it across the desk as if the glowing red text were physically burning her fingers. "Julian, this is some kind of glitch. A computer error. I don't understand these coding strings." Julian Vance leaned forward, placing both of his large hands flat on the desk. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of his presence seemed to instantly suck all the oxygen out of the room. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice to scream at her. He delivered the executioner's blow with the surgical, terrifying precision of a machine programmed to destroy. 11:42 p.m. January 14th, Julian recited, his voice echoing off the bulletproof glass like the heavy, final tolling of a church bell. "The infrared sensors on your front porch are triggered. The local power grid is fully operational. The camera is not damaged." "No." Vivian gasped, her eyes darting wildly around the room, absolute panic taking over her central nervous system. "No, the storm. The cables were down. Everyone knows the cables were down. 11:43 and 15 seconds, Julian continued, completely ignoring her pathetic, whimpering interruption. He was reading her a death sentence, and he was not going to be stopped by her lies. System cloud logs confirm a biometric Face ID unlock from your personal device. You manually activated the LiveView security protocol. The LED indicator on your porch switched to active red. You sat in your living room, Vivian. You sat there for 18 uninterrupted minutes, and you watched a 7-year-old girl freeze to death on your doorstep. Julian, stop! She shrieked, the pristine facade of the high society queen completely melting away into a grotesque, panicked hysteria. She gripped the edges of the desk, her knuckles turning bone white as she tried to anchor herself to reality. It was dark. I didn't know who they were. They looked like intruders trying to break in. I am a widow living alone in a massive estate. I panicked. It was self-defense, Julian. You have to understand the psychology of the moment. And at 11:45 p.m., Julian delivered the final fatal strike, his icy blue eyes drilling straight through her skull, completely immune to her manipulations. While you were actively watching them die on your screen, you sent a remote hardware command from your phone. You manually deactivated the auxiliary heating grid on the front porch. You turned off the heat to shoo them away. The room plunged into a suffocating, terrifying silence. The trap had slammed shut, and its steel teeth had completely, irrevocably crushed her spine. The silence that swallowed the presidential suite was so absolute, so overwhelmingly suffocating, that I could actually hear the erratic, frantic thumping of Vivian Sinclair's heart pounding violently against her ribs. The grand, untouchable illusion of the high society queen had been completely and instantaneously incinerated. Vivian tried to stand up, perhaps driven by some primal, adrenaline-fueled instinct to flee the room, but her legs completely gave out beneath her. She fell back heavily into the plush leather guest chair. Her elbow violently struck the heavy crystal water glass resting on the edge of the ebony desk. It tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of jagged, glittering pieces. The ice water soaked rapidly into the pristine $50,000 Persian rug, mixing with the melted, dirty snow that had dripped from my rubber work boots. It was a beautiful, chaotic, and pathetic mess. Julian, please, Vivian gasped, her voice completely stripped of its practiced elegance and artificial warmth. It was a pathetic, wet, guttural sound. The heavy layers of expensive foundation and contour on her face could no longer hide the stark, terrifying reality of a cornered, desperate animal. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she frantically clawed at the collar of her tailored Chanel suit, as if the luxurious fabric were suddenly strangling her. You have to listen to me, she begged, her trembling hands reaching out across the desk, completely ignoring the glowing red metadata on the iPad that had just signed her death warrant. It's not what it looks like. You know how the media twists things. You know how these lower-class people operate. They were loitering. They were trying to break in. I am a wealthy widow living alone in a massive, isolated estate. I panicked. It was self-defense, Julian. You have to understand the psychology of the moment. She was still doing it. Even with the undeniable digital proof of her cold-blooded murder staring her right in the face, she was still trying to weaponize her wealth and her whiteness. She was still trying to paint my innocent, freezing 7-year-old daughter as a dangerous, menacing criminal. Julian Vance didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He sat there with the terrifying, unyielding stillness of a gargoyle carved from solid ice. He looked down at her outstretched, trembling hands with a level of absolute, unfiltered disgust that was almost palpable in the air. Data does not possess a psychology, Vivian, Julian said softly. His voice was a lethal metallic whisper that commanded every square inch of the room. Data does not panic. Data does not lie. And data certainly does not care about your pathetic, racist rationalizations. You watched a child freeze to death for 18 minutes, and then you manually turned off the heat to accelerate her heart failure. That is not self-defense. That is murder in the first degree. Vivian let out a sharp hysterical sob. She pulled her hands back, covering her face as the realization of her impending doom finally crushed her spine. But a monster like her never truly surrenders. They only look for a different angle to manipulate. She wiped her tears aggressively, leaving dark, ugly streaks of expensive mascara running down her pale, sunken cheeks. Okay, fine, she stammered, her eyes wild, frantically searching Julian's face for any sign of a weakness, any vulnerability she could buy. What do you want? Is it the foundation? You want total controlling rights? I'll step down immediately. I'll sign the entire board over to you right this second. You can have the 10 million, you can have 50 million. I'll transfer my personal offshore portfolios to Vance Security by noon. Julian, we are both part of the elite. We don't destroy each other over a street child. We handle things quietly. She genuinely believed it. She truly deeply believed that because my daughter was poor and black, her life was just a cheap, disposable commodity that could be swept under the rug with a massive wire transfer. She thought she was sitting in a boardroom negotiating a hostile corporate merger, completely blind to the fact that she was actually sitting in an execution chamber. Julian Vance slowly stood up. He buttoned his midnight blue suit jacket with a calm, methodical precision. He looked down at her from his towering height, his broad shoulders completely blotting out the golden sunlight streaming through the windows. There is no we, Vivian, he stated, his voice echoing with absolute, terrifying finality. And there will be no quiet handling of this. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit and pulled out a sleek, heavily encrypted smartphone. He didn't dial a number. He simply tapped the screen twice. As of 60 seconds ago, Julian announced, looking directly into her terrified, bloodshot eyes, that entire data packet, the biometric logins, the thermal sensor logs, the LiveView timestamps, and the manual heater override command, was transmitted through a secure, encrypted tunnel directly to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Cybercrimes Division has already verified the digital signatures. They know exactly what you did. Vivian let out a blood-curdling shriek. She lunged forward, her perfectly manicured fingernails scratching desperately against the heavy wood of the desk, as if she could somehow climb across it and snatch the phone from his hands to undo the transmission. Furthermore, Julian continued, his voice completely drowning out her hysterical screaming, utilizing my supreme executive authority as the primary corporate guarantor of your so-called charity, I have officially triggered a catastrophic fraud alert across all associated financial networks. The Zuri Hope Foundation has been completely frozen. Your personal banking accounts, your offshore trusts, and your investment portfolios have been locked by the SEC pending a federal homicide investigation. You cannot hire your high-priced defense lawyers, Vivian. You cannot buy your way out of this. You are entirely, permanently bankrupt. The absolute totality of her destruction finally hit her. It wasn't just the threat of a prison cell. It was the violent, instantaneous stripping of her godhood. Vivian Sinclair collapsed. She slid off the luxurious leather chair and crumpled onto the floor, falling right into the puddle of spilled ice water and melted snow. The ultra-rich, untouchable queen of the city was now crawling on her hands and knees on a wet carpet, sobbing so violently she was choking on her own saliva. The luxurious silver fox fur coat slipped off her shoulders, soaking up the dirty water like a sponge. "Oh God!" she wailed, her hands clutching weakly at the heavy wooden legs of the desk. "Please God, Lord, have mercy on me. Please, I beg you, God, don't let them take everything from me." That was the trigger. Hearing that demonic, blood-soaked monster dare to scream the name of the Lord for mercy caused a violent, uncontrollable physical reaction inside my chest. The silent, invisible janitor died in that dark corner of the room, and the mother of Zuri stepped forward into the blinding sunlight. I dropped my yellow microfiber cleaning cloth. It hit the hardwood floor with a soft, dull thud. I stepped out of the shadows, the heavy, rhythmic thud of my rubber work boots echoing aggressively across the room, completely silencing Vivian's hysterical wailing. She froze. She slowly turned her head, looking up from the wet floor, her tear-streaked, ruined face twisting in absolute confusion. She looked at my faded blue uniform, my heavy canvas apron, and then slowly up to my face. For a few agonizing seconds, her privileged brain simply could not process why a lowly cleaning woman was aggressively approaching her in a billionaire's office. And then I watched the exact moment her memory connected the dots. She looked into my dark, burning eyes. She saw the same face that had begged her for mercy on her freezing porch in the middle of a blizzard. She saw the mother of the child she had murdered. A fresh, suffocating wave of pure terror washed over her. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her expensive Chanel skirt riding up, her ruined fur coat dragging through the dirty water. She backed up frantically until her spine slammed hard against the base of the bulletproof glass window. There was nowhere left to run. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. The fury inside me was far too cold, far too absolute for something as cheap as shouting. I reached deep into the pocket of my canvas apron. My fingers wrapped around the small, precious object I had carried with me every single day since that horrific storm. I pulled out Zuri's pink knitted mitten. It was tiny. It was frayed at the edges. And it was still incredibly stiff, permanently hardened by the freezing moisture of the ice that had claimed my daughter's life. I stood directly over Vivian Sinclair, looking down at her pathetic, trembling form. I raised my hand and threw the frozen pink mitten with a sharp, violent flick of my wrist. It struck her directly in the chest and dropped onto her lap. Vivian gasped, violently flinching away from the tiny piece of fabric as if it were a venomous snake. She stared at the pink mitten, her body shaking so uncontrollably her teeth were loudly chattering together in the silent room. "My daughter begged you for a fraction of your warmth," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a heavy metallic resonance that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the office. "She gave her only coat to her baby brother, while you watched her die for your own sick entertainment. You do not have the right to call upon God with your filthy, murderous mouth." Vivian looked up at me, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, completely paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of her sins finally staring her right in the face. "You can keep your tears, Vivian," I whispered, leaning down just enough so she could feel the absolute, unyielding hatred radiating from my soul. "And you should keep your breath too. Because where you are going, it is going to be incredibly, unbearably cold." The heavy mahogany doors of the presidential suite did not open with a polite, deferential knock. They were breached with the sharp, authoritative and uncompromising force of a coordinated federal raid. 4 agents from the FBI's cybercrimes and financial fraud divisions strode aggressively into the room. They wore dark, utilitarian suits and carried themselves with a grim, mechanical efficiency that immediately neutralized the suffocating luxury of the office. There were no flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the glass windows. There were no sirens wailing in the distance. Julian Vance had orchestrated this entire, devastating takedown with the exact same terrifying, soundless precision he used to write his encrypted software code. Vivian Sinclair was roughly hauled to her feet. The lead agent didn't look at her with the fawning, pathetic deference she was so accustomed to receiving from the city's corrupt elite. He looked at her the way a seasoned exterminator looks at a violent, disgusting pest. He grabbed her arms, twisted them sharply behind her back with practiced force, and slammed a pair of heavy, cold steel handcuffs over her delicate wrists. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of the cuffs locking into place over the expensive fabric of her Chanel suit was the most beautiful, vindicating music I had ever heard in my entire life. Vivian Sinclair, you are under arrest for first-degree murder, aggravated wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and the criminal misappropriation of charitable funds, the lead agent recited, his voice completely deadpan, effortlessly droning out her frantic high-pitched shrieks. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. I am Vivian Sinclair, she screamed, thrashing wildly against the unyielding, iron grip of the federal agents. Her luxurious silver fox fur coat finally slipped entirely off her shoulders, falling into the puddle of dirty water and dragging across the floor like a dead animal. You cannot do this to me. I demand to call my corporate lawyers. I demand to speak to the mayor. You are making a catastrophic mistake. Do you have any idea who I am? Her assets have been federally frozen, Agent, Julian Vance stated calmly from behind his massive ebony desk. He didn't even bother to look up at her as he casually capped his solid gold fountain pen, slipping it back into his breast pocket. She cannot afford a lawyer. And the mayor is currently ignoring her frantic phone calls to avoid being federally indicted alongside her. Get this trash out of my office. The agents yanked her toward the door. Vivian turned her head, desperately looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows, perhaps hoping to see the news vans, the helicopters, and the flashing cameras of the paparazzi she had spent millions cultivating. She was a master manipulator. She knew that if she could just get in front of a camera lens, she could cry, she could hyperventilate, she could play the tragic victim of a massive corporate conspiracy. She was desperately craving an audience to manipulate. But Julian Vance was 10 steps ahead of her. Agents, Julian called out, stopping them just as they reached the threshold of the office. Do not take her down through the main lobby. Use the south service corridors. Take her down in the freight elevator, the one used for the garbage disposal. Vivian's eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. The freight elevator. The exact same cramped, filthy metal box that I used every single night to haul dripping bags of trash and dirty mop buckets down to the basement. It smelled permanently of industrial bleach, rotting cardboard, and stale sweat. For a woman who had spent her entire life floating on a cloud of unimaginable privilege, wealth, and white supremacy, being dragged out of a skyscraper through the garbage chute in handcuffs was a profound psychological execution. No, you can't, she wailed, digging her expensive stilettos into the carpet, trying desperately to resist the forward momentum of the agents. Not the service elevator. Please. I am a philanthropist. But they didn't care. They dragged her out of the room, her pathetic, sobbing protests echoing down the long hallway until the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, sealing her fate forever. And then there was silence. The suffocating tension in the room slowly evaporated, leaving behind a profound, breathless stillness. The monster was gone. The empire of lies she had built on the frozen corpse of my daughter had been utterly, permanently demolished in less than 20 minutes. I stood there in the center of the office, staring at the spot where she had been crawling on her knees just moments before. But Vivian Sinclair wasn't the only casualty of the metadata that morning. Julian tapped a button on his desk console. The large glass monitor on the wall shifted, seamlessly transitioning from the glowing blue code to a live, high-definition security feed of the company's ground floor lobby. My breath caught in my throat. Down on the marble floor of the lobby, David was being escorted out of the building. But he wasn't just being fired. 2 federal agents were flanking him, pulling his arms behind his back and slapping handcuffs onto his wrists right in front of hundreds of his shocked coworkers. "A chain is only as strong as its weakest link, Nia," Julian said coldly, watching the monitor as David panicked, his face pale as he desperately tried to explain himself to the feds. "Your friend David thought he could accept a $3 million bribe to tamper with digital evidence in a federal homicide investigation. He thought wiping a localized hard drive would hide his treason against my company." Julian picked up his coffee cup, his expression completely devoid of pity. "I didn't just fire him. When I ordered the cloud extraction, the system flagged his anomaly. I triggered an aggressive clawback protocol on the offshore wire transfer Vivian sent him. The $3 million is gone. It never even cleared the holding account. He is completely bankrupt, permanently blacklisted from the tech industry, and facing 10 years in federal prison for obstruction of justice and wire fraud. He sold his soul for absolutely nothing." I watched the screen as David was shoved aggressively into the back of a black federal cruiser, his head bowed in ultimate crushing shame. The shiny new Rolex on his wrist mocked him in the sunlight. I felt no sympathy for him. He had chosen to side with the devil, and now he was going to burn in the exact same hell. I reached around my waist and untied the heavy knot of my canvas janitor's apron. I let it drop to the floor, right on top of the ruined Persian rug. I would never scrub another floor in this building again. I would never be invisible again. Julian Vance looked down at the tiny, frozen pink mitten resting on the floor, and then at the $10 million check on his desk. "This money will not be returned to my corporate treasury," Julian said quietly, his icy blue eyes meeting mine. "I am stripping Vivian's name off the board of directors and placing the foundation under the direct control of an independent, federal trust. Every single penny of that money, along with the liquidated assets from Vivian's seized estates, will be used to build a network of free, state-of-the-art pediatric clinics across the poorest neighborhoods in this city. They will bear Zuri's name, and her name will mean something real." I nodded slowly, the tight, burning knot that had lived in my chest for months finally beginning to loosen. "Thank you, Mr. Vance, for looking at the data. Data is the only thing in this world that demands absolute justice, Nia," he replied. I turned my back on the billionaire and walked out of the presidential suite, the morning sun warming my face as I stepped into the elevator. Months have passed since that morning. 300 miles away, surrounded by triple-layered razor wire and towering concrete walls, federal inmate number 40,982 sits shivering violently on a thin steel-framed cot. Vivian Sinclair is no longer the untouchable queen of the city's elite. The tailored Chanel suits and the luxurious silver fox fur have been permanently replaced by a stiff, faded orange jumpsuit that offers absolutely no protection against the biting winter draft seeping through her barred window. She pulls the scratchy, paper-thin prison blanket tighter around her trembling shoulders, her teeth chattering so aggressively that her jaw physically aches. She is entirely, hopelessly alone. As she weeps in the freezing dark, a faint mechanical click echoes from the upper corner of her concrete cell. Vivian violently flinches. She slowly raises her head, her tear-streaked face pale with sudden blinding terror. Mounted securely near the ceiling is a heavy-duty federal security camera, and right in the center of its dark lens, a tiny, glowing red LED light blinks steadily. It stares down at her, cold, unblinking, and absolutely merciless. It is watching her shiver. It is watching her suffer. In her breaking, traumatized mind, she is finally trapped in the exact same icy, silent hell she created, forced to endure the unforgiving cold while the red eye of karma watches her every single miserable breath. Trey and I do not live in a damp, moldy motel room anymore. We moved into a small, warm, beautiful little house with a backyard full of green grass and a front porch that is always flooded with bright, golden sunlight. This morning I sat at the kitchen table watching my little boy, He is 4 years old now. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by a brand new box of crayons. He picked up a bright yellow one and began drawing a massive, radiant sun over a picture of a little house. He doesn't draw the heavy black doors anymore. And he never, ever reaches for the red crayon. The terrifying red eye of the Snow Queen has been completely erased from his nightmares. People often think that karma is a loud, chaotic explosion. They expect justice to arrive with thunderous applause, screaming sirens, and dramatic courtroom battles. But sometimes, karma is the quietest, most terrifyingly silent force in the universe. Sometimes it is just a glowing red LED light in the darkness. Sometimes it is an unalterable string of code resting on a server thousands of miles away, patiently waiting to spring the trap. I walked over to the window, feeling the gentle warm breeze brush against my skin. I looked up at the boundless clear blue sky, placing my hand over my heart. I could almost feel a second heartbeat in there, small, gentle, and perfectly at peace. You can rest now, my sweet, brave Zuri. The red eye is gone. The monsters are in their cages, and the sun is finally beautifully shining on your little brother. The wheels of the American justice system are notoriously agonizingly slow, especially when they are forced to grind against the rusted, entrenched armor of the elite. Even with all her assets federally frozen, even with her reputation completely incinerated in the court of public opinion, Vivian Sinclair's trial did not happen overnight. It took 8 grueling months of legal maneuvering, desperate delay tactics, and pathetic appeals from her state-appointed public defender, before we finally stepped into the grand mahogany-paneled federal courtroom. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing a simple, neat black dress. I was no longer the invisible, shivering woman begging on a freezing porch, nor was I the nameless janitor scrubbing the floors of a corporate skyscraper. I was the mother of Zuri, and I was there to watch the final nail being driven into the coffin of the monster who murdered her. When the bailiff led Vivian Sinclair into the courtroom, a collective audible gasp rippled through the packed gallery. The press pool, kept behind a velvet rope, leaned forward in stunned silence. The untouchable, glamorous queen of high society was entirely gone. Because Julian Vance had successfully locked her offshore trusts and seized her estates, she couldn't afford her usual army of ruthless corporate lawyers. She couldn't afford her private stylists. She was forced to wear a cheap, ill-fitting gray pantsuit provided by the state. Her roots had grown out, revealing stark, wiry gray hair that hung limply around her pale, sunken face. The devastating arrogance that used to radiate from her pores had been replaced by a paranoid, twitchy desperation. She refused to look at me. She kept her eyes glued to the defense table, her bony hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles white. The trial was a systematic, merciless dissection of her lies. The lead federal prosecutor did not rely on emotional appeals. He didn't need to. He had the metadata. When Julian Vance was called to the witness stand as the prosecution's premier technical expert, the entire courtroom temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Julian wore his signature midnight blue suit, sitting perfectly upright, his icy blue eyes fixed on the jury box. With surgical, terrifying precision, Julian projected the Vance Cloud Enterprise log audit onto the massive screens in the courtroom. He walked the jury through every single timestamp. He explained the biometric Face ID unlock. He explained the 18-minute live view stream. And finally, he explained the manual override command that killed the porch heater. Vivian's public defender, a tired, overworked man who clearly knew he was fighting a losing battle, desperately tried to float the theory of a cyber attack. He paced in front of the jury, waving his hands. "Isn't it possible, Mr. Vance, that a sophisticated hacker infiltrated the Sinclair estate network? Couldn't someone else have hijacked the camera, watched the tragic events unfold, and turned off the heat remotely to frame my client?" Julian Vance leaned into the microphone. He didn't blink.
No, counselor.
It is completely impossible. The Vance security architecture requires a localized, biological facial scan to authorize a hardware override of that magnitude. Furthermore, if the defense wishes to claim a hypothetical hacker framed Mrs. Sinclair, they will have to explain why Mrs. Sinclair actively attempted to bribe a Vance security employee to delete the local logs. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic frenzy of whispers. The judge slammed his wooden gavel, demanding order. Vivian's face drained of all remaining color. She shrank down in her chair, looking like a cornered rat trapped in a blinding spotlight. The prosecution's next witness was the final, devastating kill shot. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and David was led down the center aisle. He was wearing a bright orange federal prison jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles shackled in heavy steel chains. He had already pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and wire fraud, and in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence, he had agreed to testify against the woman who bought his soul. As David took the stand, he finally looked at me. His eyes were hollow, filled with a crushing, permanent regret. Then, he turned his gaze to Vivian Sinclair. "She paid me," David testified, his voice echoing through the silent room. "She had her private security team intercept me in an underground parking garage. She offered me an untraceable $3 million offshore wire transfer. In exchange, she ordered me to wipe the Tier 2 local servers that housed the connection logs for her front porch camera. She specifically told me that a destitute black janitor was trying to blackmail her, and she needed the digital footprint erased." "Liar!" Vivian suddenly shrieked, losing whatever fragile grip she had left on her sanity. She leaped out of her chair, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at David. "He's a liar. He's a disgusting, low-class criminal trying to save his own skin. I am a philanthropist. I gave millions to this city. You are all conspiring against me. Restrain the defendant," the judge roared, slamming his gavel repeatedly. Two massive federal marshals instantly grabbed Vivian by the shoulders, forcing her violently back into her seat. The jury didn't even need a full afternoon to deliberate. They returned in less than 2 hours. The foreperson, a stern-faced woman, stood up and read the verdict. Guilty of aggravated manslaughter. Guilty of wire fraud. Guilty of obstruction of justice. Guilty on all 7 counts. The judge looked down at Vivian from his elevated bench. His eyes held absolutely no mercy. "Vivian Sinclair," the judge's voice boomed across the courtroom, "you used your immense wealth to build a facade of extreme charity, while harboring a soul of absolute, breathtaking cruelty. You watched an innocent child freeze to death for your own twisted peace of mind, and then you used the tragedy to enrich yourself. Your actions represent the absolute darkest, most vile depths of human greed. I hereby sentence you to life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole." Vivian's legs gave out. She collapsed against the defense table, wailing in a high-pitched, agonizing frequency. The marshals hauled her to her feet and dragged her down the center aisle. As she passed the gallery, she looked at me one last time. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stared back at her with eyes as cold as the ice she had left my daughter to die on. She was dragged out through the heavy wooden doors, her screams fading into the hollow corridors of the courthouse. 6 months after the gavel dropped, a completely different kind of crowd gathered in the heart of the city's poorest, most neglected neighborhood. There were no news cameras hunting for a scandal. There were no corrupt politicians or high society socialites. Instead, the streets were filled with working-class families, single mothers, and hundreds of smiling, energetic children. The air smelled of fresh paint, blooming flowers, and the sweet, sugary scent of the neighborhood bakery that had catered the event. I stood on a small wooden stage, looking up at the towering, beautiful 5-story building made of bright white stone and massive glass windows. Above the main entrance, forged in heavy, gleaming bronze letters, read the name, the Zuri Hope Pediatric Medical Center. It was entirely funded by the $10 million Julian Vance had redirected, along with the liquidated assets of Vivian Sinclair's seized estates. It was a state-of-the-art facility, fully staffed with the best pediatricians in the state, dedicated to providing absolutely free, world-class healthcare to any child who walked through its doors, regardless of their parents' bank accounts. Julian Vance was there, standing quietly at the very back of the crowd. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just a simple dark coat. He didn't want to make a speech. He didn't want his name on the building. The data god had finally found a variable that algorithms couldn't calculate: the enduring, unbreakable power of a mother's love. We locked eyes for a brief second across the sea of people, and he gave me a single respectful nod before turning and walking away into the bustling city streets. Trey tugged at my hand. I looked down at my beautiful boy. He was 5 years old now, wearing a tiny, neat little suit, his eyes wide with wonder as he looked at the massive hospital. "Is that for Zuri, Mommy?" he asked, his voice bright and clear. "Yes, baby," I whispered, kneeling down to hug him tightly. "That is for Zuri. And it's for you. And it's for every little kid who needs a safe, warm place." The mayor of the district handed me an oversized pair of golden scissors. I stepped up to the thick, bright pink ribbon stretched across the double glass doors. I took a deep breath, letting the warm, golden sunlight wash over my face. I thought about the blinding, suffocating snow. I thought about the terrifying red eye of the camera. I thought about the cold, concrete cell where a monster was currently spending the rest of her miserable life. And then I squeezed the scissors. The pink ribbon fell to the ground, and the crowd erupted into deafening, joyous applause. Justice had not been fast. It had not been easy. It had required walking through the absolute darkest valleys of human cruelty and facing down a titan of wealth. But as I watched dozens of children run excitedly through the open doors of the clinic, their laughter echoing into the sky, I knew that the ultimate victory belonged to the light. The red eye was forever blind. But Zuri's light would never, ever go out. 2 years. That is how long it took for the ghost of Vivian Sinclair to reach out from the grave she had dug for herself. The Zuri Hope Pediatric Medical Center was no longer just a building. It was a thriving, beating heart in the center of a community that the city's elite had spent decades trying to ignore and erase. I was no longer pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket through the sterile, aggressively air-conditioned hallways of a tech billionaire's skyscraper in the dead of night. I was the executive director of a multi-million-dollar medical foundation. I spent my days walking through brightly painted hospital corridors, surrounded by the laughter of healing children, coordinating massive grants that Julian Vance and I had ruthlessly stripped from Vivian's corrupt, blood-soaked empire. My life was full of light. My son Trey was flourishing, a brilliant and happy little boy who no longer woke up screaming in terror about the red eye in the dark. And then the letter arrived. It was a standard, cheap government-issued envelope, stamped with the harsh black ink seal of a maximum security federal women's penitentiary. Inside was a formal visitation request form. Vivian Sinclair wanted to see me. My first instinct was to throw the paper directly into the heavy-duty office shredder, to let the metal blades chew her name into unrecognizable confetti, exactly like David had done to my only piece of evidence all those years ago. Why should I give a single second of my precious time to the monster who sat in a climate-controlled living room and watched my 7-year-old daughter freeze to death on her marble porch? Why should I step back into her world of concrete and razor wire when I had spent so much blood, sweat, and tears pulling myself into the sun? But as I held that cheap, scratchy piece of prison paper in my hands, A quiet, undeniable realization settled deep into my bones. Vivian wasn't reaching out to apologize. Sociopaths of her caliber do not experience genuine remorse. They only experience the agonizing, suffocating regret of being caught and stripped of their power. She wanted something from me, and I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to look her in the eye one last, final time to prove to myself, and to her, that the power dynamic had been permanently, irreversibly shattered. The drive to the Federal Correctional Facility took 4 hours. I left the vibrant, bustling streets of the city behind, driving deep into a barren, desolate landscape where the government buries the people society has discarded. The prison was a terrifying monument to human misery. A sprawling fortress of brutalist gray concrete, heavy steel doors, and triple-layered razor wire that glinted sharply in the pale afternoon sun. I walked through the intense security checkpoints, my sensible heels clicking sharply against the cold linoleum floor. The air inside smelled of industrial bleach, stale sweat, and crushing despair. A smell I recognized perfectly from my years scrubbing the basement service elevators of the corporate elite. But this time I wasn't the help. I was a free woman, a powerful woman, walking through the belly of the beast entirely on my own terms. I was led into a sterile, heavily guarded visitation room divided entirely by a thick, smudge-covered wall of bulletproof plexiglass. I sat down on a hard plastic chair, picking up the heavy black telephone receiver on my side of the glass. And then the heavy steel door on the opposite side of the room buzzed open with a loud, aggressive mechanical clank. I had prepared myself for the sight, but the sheer, devastating physical reality of Vivian Sinclair's decay still sent a profound shockwave through my system. The untouchable, glamorous queen of high society was entirely, irrevocably gone. She shuffled into the room, her wrists and ankles bound in heavy steel transport chains that rattled violently with every agonizingly slow step she took. She was drowning in a faded, stiff orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off her emaciated, bony frame. The luxurious silver fox fur coats and the custom-tailored Chanel suits were a distant, mocking memory. Her flawless, platinum blonde hair had been replaced by a tangled, greasy, and completely gray mess that clung to her sunken, hollow cheeks. Her skin, once maintained by thousands of dollars of premium serums and exclusive spa treatments, was now a sickly, translucent shade of gray, stretched tightly over her skull like parchment paper. She looked exactly like what she had always been on the inside. A rotting, hollow corpse. A female correctional officer forcefully shoved her into the metal chair opposite mine. Vivian's trembling, heavily bruised hands reached for the telephone receiver. She pressed it against her ear. Her eyes bloodshot and completely wild with a paranoid, twitchy desperation, locked onto mine through the thick plexiglass. "Nia," she gasped, her voice a fragile, raspy, and pathetic croak. It sounded like grinding sandpaper. "You came. Oh, thank God you came." I didn't say a single word. I just sat there, my posture perfectly straight, my face an impenetrable mask of calm, cold stone. I let the heavy silence stretch out, forcing her to feel the agonizing, crushing weight of my presence. "It's the cold, Nia," Vivian wept, pressing her free, trembling hand against the glass, leaving a greasy smudge on the barrier between us. "The heating system in this cell block. It's broken. It's always broken. The air vents just blow freezing wine directly onto my metal cot. I only have one thin, scratchy blanket. I shiver so hard at night that my teeth are cracking. The guards don't care. They look at me like I'm a diseased animal. I'm freezing. No. I'm freezing to death in here." I stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity. No sympathy. Just a profound cosmic vindication that the universe was exacting the exact toll she owed. "I've changed," she pleaded, her voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch as tears spilled over her hollow cheeks. "I found the Lord, Nia. I read the Bible every single day in my cell. I know what I did was wrong. I was blinded by fear, by the storm, by everything. But I've repented. I am a woman of God now. She leaned closer to the glass, her eyes wide, finally revealing the true, manipulative transaction she was desperately trying to orchestrate. My state-appointed lawyer says there is a compassionate release program for elderly inmates, she whispered rapidly, her breath fogging up the plexiglass. If the victim's family submits a formal letter of forgiveness, a public statement confirming that the defendant has shown genuine remorse and poses no threat, the parole board has to review it. You have a massive platform now, Nia. You're on the news, you run that foundation. If you tell them I deserve mercy, if you tell them I've suffered enough, they'll transfer me to a minimum security medical facility. They have real heating there, Nia. Please, I am begging you. As a mother, as a Christian, you have to forgive me. There it was. The absolute, unadulterated core of her narcissism. Even after losing her entire empire, even after being locked in a cage like an animal, she still viewed me as nothing more than a tool to be utilized. She thought she could invoke the name of the Lord to manipulate a black woman into signing her get-out-of-jail-free card. She still fundamentally believed that her physical comfort was more important than justice for my murdered child. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the sterile, cold air of the prison fill my lungs. I looked at her trembling, pathetic form, and I spoke for the very first time since sitting down. My daughter was 7 years old, Vivian, I said, my voice quiet, smooth, and carrying the lethal, crushing weight of an anvil. She didn't have a public defender to file appeals for her. She didn't have a parole board to beg to. She didn't even have a scratchy prison blanket. She only had a thin pink coat, which she gave to her baby brother while you manually turned off the only source of heat keeping her heart beating. Vivian violently flinched, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the harsh, undeniable truth slapped her across the face. I didn't drive 4 hours to this miserable concrete box to grant you absolution, I continued, my dark eyes boring directly into her soul, stripping away whatever pathetic hope she had left. I came here to tell you exactly what your money is doing on the outside. Vivian's eyes widened in sheer terror. She tried to pull the phone away from her ear, but her hand was paralyzed. She was forced to listen. Your $10 million, I said, leaning closer to the glass, is currently paying for the chemotherapy of dozens of children whose parents you wouldn't have even allowed to scrub your toilets. The liquidated assets from the forced sale of your massive, luxurious estate? We used that money to build a state-of-the-art pediatric cardiac wing. The offshore trust funds you tried to hide? They are buying winter coats, hot meals, and safe housing for the exact same homeless families you consider to be human trash. A guttural, agonizing wail began to build deep within Vivian's throat. Your entire legacy, Vivian, I whispered, delivering the final fatal psychological blow. The empire of wealth, privilege, and exclusivity you spent your entire life ruthlessly protecting has been completely dismantled and handed over to the poor. Every time a child's life is saved in my hospital, it is paid for by your destruction. You are nothing now. You are just a ghost haunting a freezing concrete cell. And the world has already forgotten your name. No! She shrieked into the receiver, dropping the phone and slamming her shackled fists frantically against the bulletproof plexiglass. You can't do this. You have to forgive me.
I'm freezing.
Nia, please. I didn't blink. I simply reached out and placed the heavy black receiver back onto the hook, cutting off her hysterical begging screams instantly. The silence on my side of the glass was absolute, pristine, and beautiful. I stood up from the hard plastic chair. Through the plexiglass, I watched as two heavy-set correctional officers grabbed Vivian by her frail, bony arms, dragging her away from the window. She thrashed and kicked, her mouth wide open in a silent, agonizing scream, her heavy steel chains rattling violently as they hauled her back into the freezing dark bowels of the prison. I turned my back on her and walked out of the visitation room. I walked down the long gray corridors, passed through the heavy metal detectors, and finally pushed open the heavy steel doors leading to the outside world. The afternoon sun hit my face, warm, golden, and profoundly liberating. I took a deep breath of the fresh, crisp air, feeling the gentle breeze on my skin. I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove away from the fortress of misery. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing left for me in that place. The red eye was permanently closed, the monster was locked in the ice, and I had a hospital full of bright, beautiful children waiting for me to come home. 15 years have passed since the heavy rusted steel doors of that federal penitentiary violently slammed shut on Vivian Sinclair. Time is a fascinating, unstoppable force. For those who live in the light, time is a healer, a gentle breeze that slowly smooths over the sharp, jagged edges of profound trauma. But for those locked in the dark, trapped inside a freezing concrete cell with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own sins, time is the ultimate, excruciating torture. I was informed by a brief, automated bureaucratic letter a few years ago that federal inmate 40982 had passed away in the prison's medical wing. There were no breaking news alerts on the television. There were no glossy magazine retrospectives honoring her life. There was no grand high society funeral filled with weeping billionaires and corrupt politicians. Vivian Sinclair, the woman who once believed she was a living god, died entirely alone, shivering under a thin state-issued blanket, completely forgotten by the world she had so ruthlessly tried to conquer. Her body was cremated, and her ashes were quietly disposed of by the state. The empire of lies she built had been entirely wiped from the face of the earth, leaving not a single solitary trace of her existence. As for David, the young analyst who sold his soul for a $3 million wire transfer that he never even got to keep, he was released from federal prison 2 years ago. He is a ghost now. He works a minimum wage job at a desolate gas station on the outskirts of the state, his face aged and weathered far beyond his years. He is permanently barred from ever touching a computer network again. The elite class he so desperately tried to appease chewed him up, spat him out, and left him to rot in the exact same poverty he had committed treason to escape. But in the heart of the city, standing tall and proud against the skyline, the Zuri Hope Pediatric Medical Center is buzzing with vibrant, undeniable life. I walked into the grand, sunlit lobby of the hospital this morning. The air didn't smell of sterile, depressing industrial bleach like the corporate skyscrapers or the prisons. It smelled of fresh coffee, blooming lilies, and the sweet scent of a nearby bakery. The massive glass atrium allowed the golden morning sunlight to pour in, illuminating the hundreds of families, doctors, and nurses moving through the wide corridors. In the very center of the main lobby, resting on a pedestal of solid white marble, sits a thick, reinforced crystal display case. And inside that case, perfectly preserved and bathed in a soft, warm spotlight, is a tiny faded pink knitted mitten. It is not a monument to tragedy. It is a monument to the purest form of love. It is a permanent reminder to every single wealthy donor, every brilliant surgeon, and every powerful politician who walks through our doors that the ultimate price of human greed was paid by a 7-year-old girl who just wanted to keep her baby brother warm. I stood by the glass case, smiling as I watched a tall, incredibly handsome 18-year-old boy walk across the lobby. He was wearing a crisp white medical volunteer coat, a stethoscope draped casually around his neck, laughing gently as he handed a balloon to a little girl sitting in a wheelchair. It was Trey. My beautiful baby boy is no longer the traumatized toddler who woke up screaming about the Snow Queen. He grew up surrounded by love, warmth, and the relentless pursuit of justice. He is a brilliant student, heading to a top-tier medical school next fall on a full academic scholarship. He wants to be a pediatric cardiologist. He wants to spend the rest of his life fixing the broken hearts of children who the world has cast aside. He knows exactly who the pink mitten belonged to, and he knows exactly what it costs to build the walls he now walks within. But it doesn't break him, fuels him. The red eye of the camera has been entirely replaced by the bright, unyielding fire in his own heart. Julian Vance still visits the hospital once a year, exactly on the anniversary of the blizzard. The billionaire data god never brings an entourage. He never calls the press. He simply walks through the front doors in his tailored midnight blue suit, stands silently in front of the crystal display case for 5 minutes, gives me a single respectful nod, and walks back out into the city. We are not friends. We will never be friends. But we share a profound, unspoken understanding that the universe operates on a fundamental, unalterable code of balance. People always talk about karma as if it were some mystical, invisible spiritual force. They wait for lightning to strike the wicked from the sky. But in the modern world, karma is not a ghost. Karma is digital. The universe keeps its receipts. The elite can build their impenetrable fortresses of glass and steel. They can hide behind their armies of ruthless corporate lawyers, their heavily guarded gated communities, and their billion-dollar bank accounts. They can buy the silence of the media and the loyalty of desperate men. But they are not gods. They leave footprints. Every horrific action, every malicious decision, every cold-blooded command is logged on a server somewhere in the ether. Metadata does not bleed, it does not accept bribes, and it does not know fear. It simply waits in the dark, holding the absolute truth, until someone brave enough comes along to pull it into the light. If you have listened to my story this far, I want you to look around you. Do not let the breathtaking arrogance of the powerful silence your voice. If you see injustice, if you see the elite crushing the vulnerable, do not just bow your head and scrub their floors in silence. The monsters of this world thrive only in the shadows of our own fear. They rely on our compliance. But the second you refuse to be invisible, the second you stand up and demand that the truth be brought to the light, their entire house of cards violently collapses. If this story made your blood boil, if it made you believe that the scales of justice can still tip in favor of the oppressed, I need you to make your voice heard right now. Hit the like button on this video. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Scroll down into the comments section and leave a message. Tell us where you are watching from, what city, what state, what country. Tell us that you stand with Zuri, and that you stand against the cold-blooded greed of the untouchable elite. And please make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We are building a community of people who refuse to be silent, and we have so many more incredible, earth-shattering stories of karma and justice to share with you. Never forget that even in the absolute pitch black of a freezing, deadly storm, the truth always finds a way to leave a blinding light. Rest in peace, my sweet, brave little angel. The winter is permanently over. The monsters have all frozen in the dark. And for us and for thousands of children just like you, the sun is finally beautifully shining.